Chapter 14. The House, the Tree and the Monkey Cage. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Now, here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twits' house and garden.
Some house. It looks like a prison and there's not a window anywhere. Who wants windows? Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing? It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant for looking out of or not for looking into.
And what did you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles, she used to say. They keep out the nasty little children. And near the house you could see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side there was the big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree you can see the monkey cage, and there are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit, and you will hear about them later. Chapter 15. Sticky Glue. Once a week on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper, and Mr. Twit caught the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before Bird Pie Day, he would put a ladder up against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug Tight, and it was the stickiest glue in the whole world.
He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. And as the sun went down, birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. And they didn't know, the poor things, that the branches were all smeared with the horrible hug-tight glue. The moment that they landed on a branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which would be Bird Pie Day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were. They all went in the pot for Wednesday's Bird Pie Supper.
Chapter 16. 4 Sticky Little Boys. One Tuesday afternoon, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the big tree with hug-tight glue, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and stinging nettles, not when there were monkeys to go and see. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden and found a ladder leaning against the tree. They decided to climb it for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the seats of their pants to the branches. There were no birds because the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. As there are no birds for my pie tonight, it will have to be boy pie instead. He started to climb the ladder. Boy pie might even be better than bird pie, he went on horribly.
The boys were terrified. He's going to boil us, cried one of them. He'll stew us alive, the second one said. He'll cook us with some carrots. But the 4th little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, I've had an idea. We're only stuck by the seat of our pants. So quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and we'll fall to the ground. Mr. Twit had just reached the top of the ladder and was about to make a grab for the nearest boy when all of a sudden they tumbled out of the tree and ran for home with their naked little bottoms winking in the sun.
Chapter 17. The Great Upside Down Monkey Circus. Now for the monkeys. The 4 monkeys were in a cage in the garden, and they were all from one family. There was Mugglewump and his wife and their 2 small children. But what on earth were Mr. and Mrs. Twit doing with monkeys in their garden? Well, in the old days, they had both worked in a circus as monkey trainers, and they used to teach monkeys to do tricks and to dress up in human clothes and to smoke pipes and all the rest of that silly nonsense. And today, although they were retired, Mr. Twit still wanted to train monkeys. It was his great dream that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world.
And that meant the monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down, on their hands with their feet in the air. And they had to play football upside down. They had to balance one on top of each other with Mugglewump at the bottom and the smallest baby at the top. And they even had to eat and drink upside down. And that is not an easy thing to do, because the food and water has to go up your throat instead of down it.
In fact, it is almost impossible. But the monkeys simply have to do it, otherwise they got nothing. All of this sounds pretty silly to you and me, and it sounded pretty silly to the monkeys too. They absolutely hated having to do this upside down nonsense day after day. It made them giddy standing on their heads for hours on end. Sometimes the two small monkey children would faint. But Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept them practicing for 6 hours every day.
And if they didn't do what they were told, Mrs. Twit would soon come running with her beastly stick.
Chapter 18. The Roly-Poly Bird to the Rescue. Mugglewump and his family longed to escape from the cage in Mr. Twit's garden and go back to the African jungle where they came from. They hated Mr. and Mrs. Twit for making their lives so miserable, and they hated them for what they did to the birds every Tuesday and Wednesday. "Fly away, birds," they used to shout, jumping around in their cage and waving their arms. "Don't sit on the tree, it's been smeared with sticky glue, go and sit somewhere else." But these were English birds, and they couldn't understand a word that the African monkeys spoke. They took no notice and went on using the big dead tree and getting caught for bird pie. Then one day, a truly magnificent bird flew out of the sky and landed on the monkey's cage.
"Good heavens," the monkeys cried. "It's a roly-poly bird." "What on earth are you doing here, roly-poly bird?" the monkeys cried. For the roly-poly bird, just like the monkeys, was from Africa too.
And he spoke the same language that they did. "I've come for a holiday," said the roly-poly bird. "I like to travel." And he fluffed his marvellous coloured feathers and looked down rather grandly at the monkeys. "For most people," he went on, "flying on holiday is very expensive, but I can fly anywhere in the world for nothing." "Do you know how to talk English to these birds?" Mugglewump asked him. "Of course I do," said the roly-poly bird. "It's no good going to a country and not knowing the language." "Oh, then we must hurry," said Mugglewump. "Today is Tuesday, and over there you can already see the revolting Mr. Twit up the ladder, painting glue on all the branches of the big dead tree. This evening, when the birds come in to roost, you must warn them not to perch on the tree, or they will be made into bird pie." And that evening, the roly-poly bird flew round and round the big dead tree, singing, "There's sticky stuff all over the tree. If you land in the branches, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie." Chapter 19. No bird pie for Mr. Twit. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket to get all the birds from the big dead tree, there wasn't a single one on it.
They were all sitting on top of the monkey cage. The roly-poly bird was there as well, and Mugglewump and his family were inside of the cage, and the whole lot of them were laughing at Mr. Twit.
Chapter 20. Still no bird pie for Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit wasn't going to wait another week for his bird pie supper. He loved bird pie. It was his favourite meal. So that very same day he went to catch the birds again. This time he smeared all the top bars of the monkey cage with the sticky glue, as well as the branches of the tree. "Now I'll get you," he said, "whichever one you sit on." The monkeys crouched inside the cage and watched all of this. And later on, when the roly-poly bird came swooping in for an evening chat, they shouted, "Don't land on our cage, roly-poly bird. It's covered in sticky glue and so's the tree." So that evening, as the sun went down and all the birds came back in again to roost, the roly-poly bird flew around and round the cage and the tree, singing out a new warning. "There's sticky stuff now on the cage and the tree. If you land on either, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie." Chapter 21. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out of his huge basket, not a single bird was sitting on either the monkey cage or the big dead tree.
They were all perched happily on the roof of Mr. Twit's house. The roly-poly bird was up there as well, and the monkeys were in the cage, and the whole lot of them were laughing at Mr. Twit.